Hello there! If you see this, it means that the first third of the Modern Messer manual has been completed. And when I originally set out to do this project, I thought we'd get to this point a little bit sooner, but I guess I'm just an eternal optimist. All jokes aside though, I find that I put more time and effort and general preparation into these videos, so they end up taking longer than I originally expected they would. That said, I originally intended to do a couple of Patreon exclusive videos trying to break down the entire system into a bunch of lessons. On one hand, this turned out to be too ambitious because breaking down a full system into a few lessons is hard. And secondly, the structure of the project as a whole kind of caught up with me because I found there would be way too much overlap with the videos I'd be making publicly available anyway. And then I considered it would be a fun idea to take the concept of personal fencing styles and see how that relates to Leckhuizen's fight book. A fun idea, but perhaps a bit limited in scope. So finally I landed on this. I'd like to make a couple of videos that are available to you only, my patrons, and talk about what I think is important when teaching HEMA and Messer specifically. Since doing Messer means you're far more likely than the average practitioner to be running your own study group or even a full-fledged Messer class, I figured it would be quite useful to have a resource like this at your disposal. Since doing Messer will mean that you're far more likely than the average practitioner to be running a local study group or even a full-fledged Messer class, I figured a resource like this would be quite useful. To begin with, I'll just make a video for every third of the Modern Messer manual, and I'm under no impression that I'll be able to cover all the minutiae of teaching in those 3 videos. But it will be a good start, and I'll try to take the things that I found most useful and applicable to what most people run into when they teach. In the first one, I'd like to talk about goal setting, so what do you want to achieve with your teaching? The second one will cover scaling exercises and adapting classes to certain types of students. And for the final one, I'd like to take a look at the role of recapping and testing at the end of a class, or even a block of classes, or an entire year of teaching. There will probably be more subjects coming on, but those 3 would be a good place to start, I think. So, class goals, why are they so important? Well, as someone who works in education, the importance of goal setting has just been drilled into me, but that's not really a satisfactory answer, is it? Right, so to me, I think this is perhaps the biggest thing you can do to make sure that your students actually get something of value out of your class. Now, usually a goal for a class revolves around learning a certain fencing skill, but it doesn't necessarily have to be just that. A perfectly valid goal could be, for instance, to try and get like a good idea of the scope of cool things you could do with a Messer. Or a very valid goal could be simply to have fun. The important thing here is for you to have like a clear understanding of what you want students to get from a class. Because in my opinion, it's important that most, if not all of the class activities are kind of like geared towards achieving that certain goal. Now, I should of course practice what I preach, so this is what I'd like to achieve with this video in particular. I would like you to learn to combine a stated goal for a Messer class with the appropriate activities to help you achieve that goal during that class. To help with that, we're going to look at some of the theory of class goals and activities, and then simultaneously look at a lesson that I recently taught on Long Point to help clarify these concepts in practice. Now, you can, of course, copy this class word for word, and it will work just fine. Or, of course, you can also use the theory to help you sharpen the goals and activities for any lessons that you'll be creating yourself. There are a lot of different educational models to help you structure a class, but ultimately most educators agree that you get far better results when your students are actively engaged with the lesson. This, among others, requires them to be aware of the what, how, and why of a class, so that they can actively engage, think ahead, and think about how what they're doing right now relates to that. In short, it requires a clearly stated goal. Your first step as a teacher is coming up with said goal, and this may be the most underrated part of instructing. School teachers usually already have a curriculum to follow and fill in classes to align with it. As the instructor for a HEMA group, you're often made responsible for all of the goal setting for your class, in the short, medium, and even long term. Chances are you're also responsible for setting the goals of your club as a whole. I think that may fall a bit outside of the scope of this video, but some of the things I'm going to say may still be relevant for that. But let's get back to class goals for now. Ultimately, you will need to come up with an answer to the question what you want your classes to bring to your students in the next few weeks, next few months, and perhaps even the next few years. Long-term goals can be related to helping students increase their fencing skills, of course, but wanting them to have fun and be entertained or allowing them to participate in a vibrant international community are just as valid goals for the long term. The closer you get to the here and now, the more practical your goals tend to get. So for the medium term, you may find yourself stating goals around wanting your students to fence in a certain way, or what different exciting weapon disciplines to cover over several months, or even what events you'd like people to join. Finally, for the short term, you'd then be planning a block of classes around a specific skill, designing halberd classes, or organizing a trip to the upcoming sparring camp. All of these goals have in common that they benefit from being clearly formulated. I've said this before and I will say this again. I think corporate speak is dull and often awkwardly artificial, but sometimes it hits on something good. SMART goals are such an example. If you haven't encountered it before, it's a way of ensuring any goal you set is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So you shouldn't treat this as religious dogma the way some work managers do, but generally speaking, it's a good idea to make sure that your goals are not vague, with scope creep making them almost impossible to achieve and having absolutely no idea of when you want to achieve them. Exactly right, Poos. In the end, your long, medium and short-term goals will have led you to have a goal for a specific class in mind. In this case, I wanted students to be able to use Langenord as a direct attack and also be able to continue from there if that direct attack gets parried. When you have formulated a class goal, it's now time to build a class around that. Now, there's again a lot of variation possible, but something that I like to fall back on is a structure that's often referred to as the direct instruction model. It basically consists of a few different teaching phases, depending on what variation you follow, but all start with a recap of the previous class and a clear statement of your goals. At this point, it's a good idea to clearly communicate what you will be teaching, how this will happen, and why it happens this way. Usually a short bit of theory follows, but given that we practice a very physical activity, this should not last too long. After warming up, you usually start students off with some simple and well-defined exercises that are meant to help build up the skills that are stated in class goals. After which you move on to an integration phase, where students get slightly more loosely defined exercises that are rather constraint-based. At this point, they're expected to practice more together with their partner to integrate their newly learned skill with what they already know. Usually it's a good idea to recap at the end of a class and relate the student's experience during the final exercise to the goals that you set at the beginning of the class. Has the goal been achieved? And if so, how did the students manage to do so? And if not, what could still be needed? For my class, this meant that first I wanted to teach students how to make lunges and thrust efficiently, focusing on the best possible reach for the thrust versus the quickest possible recovery from the lunge. Another skill they'd learn in my class was to circumvent a parry by using durchwechseln or changing through. I wanted to take these skills through their own separate skill acquisition and integration phases, after which I would do a final integration phase to bring both together. I decided on using the step lunge game for this. Picking the appropriate exercises and activities is very much an acquired skill that you get by simply just teaching a lot of classes. But there's still a couple of tips that I think could be very helpful, and the one I'd like to focus on mostly is that I think it's very important that you try to ensure that most, if not all of your class activities are geared towards achieving that class goal. Now, there's a lot of exercises that I can pick from that I like to use often, but usually I will go for the one that aligns best with my class goal. So let's have a look at this class that I recently taught and let's see what that could look like in practice. We start with the warming up. This should usually have something to raise the heart rate a bit, so why not pick up the step lunge game straight away? For those of you who haven't seen it before, the rules are quite simple. On your turn, you get to make one step and one lunge to tag your partner in the shoulders or general chest area. Once you have come to your maximum extension, they get to do the same thing to you. Of course, you can now run backwards as much as you'd like, but you might want to only do that just a little farther than your opponent's reach, as afterwards you'll need to get back at them with just a step and a lunge. If you manage to remain untagged, of course. Once someone is tagged, the game resets and then resumes. A few minutes of this should get everyone's heart rate up. Of course, students should not be stiff or you'll risk injuries, so some stretching may be in order as well. I didn't quite catch it on camera, but I picked some hip flexor stretches and ankle stretches primarily, as they would be worked the hardest. And since it is Messer, shoulders and wrists should be warmed up as well by definition. After the warm-up, it's time to work on the mechanics of the lunge. We'll pick up some pool noodles because they are fully harmless and are a great training tool for loads of things. The game here is to walk up to the wall and at the appropriate distance lunge in such a way that the noodle bends a bit after hitting it. Additionally, the student should focus on making the lunge quickly and also recover from it quickly. A good cue for that, I find, is for people to focus on stretching their rear leg on the lunge and their front leg on the recovery. After practicing the mechanics in isolation a bit, we can work on some integration by playing a round of the step lunge game, but now with the pool noodles. After that, it's time to gear up and pick up the knives. First we do the mechanics. Simply hitting with a direct long point thrust is something the students by now know how to do, so it's time for a variation that's equally useful. The Durvexel or changing through when a direct thrust gets parried. This is again a drill that mainly focuses on the mechanics, so any feedback the students get from their peers or from you should be focused on getting the movement itself right. So using a wrist turn to get the smallest point dip necessary to thrust to the other side of the opponent's blade. The tactical application is something we'll work on with the next one. To that end, you can do a bit of a choice drill, for instance. If the student thrusts and there's no parry, they should hit. If there is a parry, they do Durvexel. If you have some advanced students, you can of course let them play with some variations to get to the long point thrust from a different setup, like a cut from above, the wheel, or something similar. Ultimately though, at some point everyone knows how to change through, so now we focus on the when and where. With this final integration phase, we play the step lunge game again, and the idea is that you now not only get to use distance to defend yourself, but you can also parry. If you do that though, your partner may redouble their thrust by doing a Durvexel. In this way, the whole of the contents of the class gets put into one exercise. If anyone still has energy afterwards, you can close out the class with a bit of guided sparring. I like guided sparring as it gives more focus and is more geared towards learning than just free sparring. Then again, I already talked about this at length, so let's see what I did with that idea for this training session. The sparring game is just sparring as usual, but we created a field that is much longer and narrower than normal. Olympic knife fighting, if you will. This should force students to fence in a more linear fashion, hopefully allowing what they worked on in class to show up in their sparring as well. If you, as an instructor, notice that they're struggling to do this, you can of course consider building up the speed and intensity gradually, instead of letting everyone go at it full tilt straight away. And that's it. These were some of my tips for building classes with clear and workable goals. To summarize, 1. You should try to have reasonable long, medium and short-term goals. You should also be able to try and clearly communicate these goals to your students. And finally, the class activities in your classes should align with the goal for that particular class. At first, this will perhaps feel a bit artificial and weird if you haven't done so before, but once you get to do this fluently, you'll find that your students will develop their skills more and overall enjoy what you're teaching them a bit more as well. There are of course plenty of other factors involved in teaching HEMA, but I think this really is a major one that might help you on your road to becoming an even better teacher than you already are. And I hope it really helps you on your way of spreading the word of the Messer wherever you may find yourself. Cheers!